Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters, the first of 2025. So, Stu, how are you?
I'm very good. Happy New Year.
And to you, I don't know when the point comes that we stop saying it, but clearly not yet.
Well, even
So,
it's February, isn't it? No, not really.
yeah, I'm going to say it in March. So, Stu, we're going to come back to a topic that won't go away.
Yeah,
We talked about this about a year ago, actually, in relation to the previous government's stance. But good old leasehold getting a bashing. We talked a year ago about will ending leasehold really happen?
yeah,
And spoiler alert, I think we concluded no, it won't. But this government seems even more sort of resolute about trying to do something with the leasehold market, doesn't it?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they do seem to have an appetite, don't they? To sort of hammer down the problems with leasehold. But yeah, as you know, as we said before, it's so frustrating the way or the term leasehold is bandied about, isn't it? The negativity that surrounds leasehold without actually, drilling down into any detail, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Angela Rayner this week, gave evidence to the Housing Communities and Local Government Committee, where she sort of, as you say, sort of doubled down on the government's intention to introduce leasehold reform legislation this parliamentary year. Um, but I just think, whatever people's political views, Stu, a classic example, of course, is the Building Safety Act, which was born out of the most legitimate of
Yeah.
concerns, of course, the terrible events of Grenfell. But actually, what we ended up with was an incredibly poorly drafted statute, which had a very, very negative effect on the leasehold market, Stu, didn't
Mhm.
it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, the more, press there is around leasehold and these type of issues, that the worse it's going to get. And I feel sorry for people that may be sort of tied up in leasehold flats where it's been a problem now with sort of EWS1 certificates and moving on to sort of high-rise buildings, and now it's becoming a complete generalization that leasehold's bad. And I think that's the word. It seems like a complete generalization, doesn't it?
Well, yes, and I mean, what made me really, really mad, and these sort of ill-informed political sound bites, where we actually had a minister recently in a sort of press release refer to fleecehold, and I
Mm.
just think, oh, please stop it, just grow up, just get some intelligence behind you, understand what you're talking about, but just these terrible sound bites. I mean, fleecehold being the worst because it just doesn't inform anything, does it?
No, absolutely. There's no value in any of that. And yeah, we're all in agreement, aren't we, that there are aspects of leases that are problematic. Nobody's ever going to disagree with that. But that's a completely different story to actually leaseholds and the tenure as a generalization being an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And my firm view is and will remain, actually, Stu, that as a form of tenure, as one of the only two legal estates in land that can be held, freehold and leasehold, as a form of tenure, there isn't in principle anything wrong with leasehold.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, it is a structure that enables the enforcement of the positive obligation to pay service charge, and
Yeah.
and it works in that sense. But certainly for somebody that's been in the business as long as I have, and I mean, I know you've only been doing it for 2 years, Stu, because you're so young, but actually it's not leasehold that's the problem. It's the industry that's grown up around it
Around
that's
it,
the
that's right.
problem. So, the freeholders seeing long residential leases as a sort of cash cow,
Yeah.
thereby pushing forward the ground rent problems that we've seen in more recent years, which theoretically at least is supposed to be being addressed fairly soon, our ground rent problem. But of course, one's got to say it. Management companies have become a very big problem in the industry for conveyancers and leaseholders, haven't they?
Absolutely. But this is nailing down the detail, isn't it? And this is where I sort of have, a problem with, the way in which it's been portrayed in the media. It's not leasehold that is the issue. And whenever we talk about, leasehold properties in general, I always try and make the distinction. Well, actually, what type of property are we dealing with here? You could have a leasehold house, it could be a masonette, it could be a high-rise building. They're completely different entities. And the detail is, what's in that lease. Leasehold may not necessarily be complicated. You can have a really simple, easy lease. It could be a masonette, for example. That could be far simpler to look at in general than, say, a complicated freehold that might have an old conveyance attached to it. So we're just hung up on the word, I feel.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what people fail to understand, and there's no grown-up discussion about it, is buildings need maintaining.
Yeah,
So if
absolutely.
people, which is a very obvious thing to say, but everybody that owns the freehold of their own house knows that they're going to have to get their gutters and their roof and everything else sorted as the building gets older. Um, and the same happens to leasehold blocks. It's a very, very obvious thing to say. But if you buy a relatively new or a brand new leasehold flat, well, hopefully, by definition, Stu, that physical fabric of that building is not going to need much doing to it. But get sort of 5, 10, 15 years down the line, maintenance is going to be needed. That's going to cost money. That's where the leaseholders get shocked. And of course,
Yeah,
insurance costs, building costs,
yeah,
materials,
absolutely.
that's all gone up considerably in the
Yeah,
last sort of 5 to 10 years.
I totally agree with you, but it's a bit like some that lives in a great big house with a long drive. They still have to maintain that long drive. But I feel, with a lot, but particularly when clients moan about management companies and service charges and maintenance, there could be, the management company still got to maintain all those common areas. And that could be right from the public highway right to that person's door. Well, that's a significant area that needs to be addressed. And like you say, if can you imagine the issues when, or in fact, when we do actually have problems with leaseholds where maintenance isn't adhered to? You could have lifts, stairwells, parking, bin stores, bike stores, and parking spaces, communal green areas. The list is endless. But of course, clients as a whole are briefed on this when they buy the property, aren't they?
Well, assuming they read what we send them,
Well, there is
Stu,
that.
assuming they read what we send them. But I think another problem, another specific
I
issue
think
that,
also, and I think that historically, I would say if you go back, 20 years maybe, the moan was always the service charge going up, or that you couldn't contact the management company to get something done. That's what I heard 20 years ago. That was almost solely it. Now the issues aren't really just that. It's, when people come to sell properties, maybe there's not a mortgage protection clause in the lease or something like that. And, other properties have all been bought, or why is it mine? But that's not leasehold's fault, is it? That's the thought of the lawyer that acted when the property was purchased or the lease was drafted. So it's a different, you've got to draw a line on it somewhere. And I feel that we're not doing that. It's all kind of included together, isn't it? And that's what's giving it the bad name.
well, and the problem is against you, it sort of comes back to the easy soundbite because everything we've said isn't an easy soundbite, and we're only scraping the surface. But something that concerns me specifically from the perspective of the conveyancer is, the good old coal-faced conveyancer, because at the end of the day, they're the poor souls that are going to have to deal with the fallout of this stuff. Um, is that we've got very piecemeal leasehold reform going on at the moment. So the government may well stand up and say, well, yes, well, reform of service charges and what is coming. Well, yes, but that's in one statute. Then we've got everything is sort of sprinkled across a number of different statutes and regulations, and there's plans and there's consultations. It's not a sort of cohesive whole. Everything is being looked at in isolation. And of course, I think what the government failed to understand, and I'm genuinely mean this of Conservative or Labour. I'm not saying this from a political perspective at all, but everything is looked at in isolation, and of course, by definition, it's all linked. So nobody is saying, well, okay, this affects this in this way. Let's look in a linear way at the whole thing and how one thing here might affect a transaction considerably down here. But of course, the great white hope at the moment, Stu, is the government's big idea to reinvigorate commonhold.
Mm.
So our sort of hybrid form of tenure, which I mean, in a very, very crude nutshell, effectively sort of gives the unit holders rather than the leaseholders the sort of, the ability to and the control over running their own development.
What's really interesting is how many clients want to do that? Because we do a lot of new build work, and some of the new build leases, it's common for the builder to put in there that the client might have to become a member or a director even, or the management company. So like, well, we get clients that massively object to that when we advise them. Well, I
Yes,
don't want to be doing that. So you're telling me that people want that, or
no, they don't.
clients want to do that?
They
I'm
don't.
not sure. I'm not so sure they do.
Well, I think the thing is we've already got a structure to allow that. Now, again, whether it needs a bit of reform is a different matter, but we've already got, the right to manage provisions. And I think the thing is, and we have talked about this in different contexts, Stu, and probably on these YouTube chats, but they are relevant. Um, but the point is, right to manage, usually a bunch of leaseholders will only exercise the right to manage if they are so hacked off, so stressed, and they've been arguing with their management company or their freeholder for so long that cohort of people sort of now feel, yes, we've reached the point of no return, we're going to actually sort of invoke the
Yeah, and
right
you
to
have to have
manage
that
procedures.
coincidental situation that it's all flat owners or all leasehold lessees that are in that situation and able to do so.
But the thing is, and what we see a lot, of course, Stu, is right when the right to manage sort of falls apart because maybe those people who were invigorated to set it up and run it because they remember how awful it was before,
Yeah,
when they move on, when they sell on, well, other
absolutely.
people come in that don't have, that sort of muscle memory about how grim it all was. And therefore the right to manage sort of, wobbles or falls away. And at the end of the day, they still are going to appoint management companies. So
Absolutely.
I think that the
For me,
lack of
I think it,
regulation of management companies is a really significant
absolutely.
issue.
No, you're just hitting the nail on the head. You absolutely stole my thunder in that one. The regulation of management companies on a practical level, you'd have thought would be far more reaching in terms of being beneficial to clients buying these sub properties. That would be excellent. I think we'd all love that.
Yeah. And it would
Um,
be more achievable, etc.,
yeah,
etc.,
yeah,
etc.
but punching another tenure that's already been here for 20 years that has received no traction whatsoever,
No.
that would need a complete cultural change across the legal industry, got disaster written all over it.
Well, you kind of hesitated there, Stu, didn't you? Because actually, the words don't come out, do they? In a sense, and I think this is the problem because, of course, the big unknown, and of course, the really big driver here is, and I don't want to talk down the leasehold market at all, but of course, the massive unknown here if commonhold is introduced or reinvigorated and becomes the default tenure, well, we have to firstly say to ourselves, okay, why didn't it become the default tenure when it was introduced in
Yep.
2002? Well, it didn't because the developers didn't pick it up. So a huge amount of this comes back to the developers. It always comes back to the developers. So they didn't pick it up because presumably they perhaps didn't want to incur the expense of either getting all of their documents changed or, Stu, I would say, I mean, to be fair, your firm acts for developers, fair enough. So did I, um, on a smaller scale, to be fair. But also, they wouldn't have wanted to be the first ones, would they? They might have had a white elephant, mightn't they? If you had one common hold,
Well,
there's like 20 or so in the
there's
country.
got to be a question mark over value if you start changing tenures. And look, we know what it's like with some of the major developers when it comes to sort of reductions on gross prices. They're very, very, very reluctant to do that. Um, they don't want anything in the register that would be, could potentially come back to hurt them. So actually, yeah, moving forward in terms of the big corporate developers and using commonhold, Christ, that would be a major shift, wouldn't it?
Well, and
And
adding to the
I
mix,
can't see one of them moving forward with it. That they would all be looking at each other, wanting to hold their hands at the same time and all jump off a cliff, wouldn't they?
yeah, and of
There's no
course
chance one's going to do it.
the other massive issue for the market, for conveyancers, for developers, for leaseholders, of course, is the lenders, the spectre
Yeah.
of the lenders, because ultimately it will be their attitude to common hold that I think will drive the market. And as you say, value is going to be a key thing.
I think an educated buyer would be very nervous about proceeding with a property that's commonhold, surely.
Yeah. Yeah,
You would be,
that's
wouldn't
even if in the initial stages they can get a mortgage on it. But shall I
you?
tell you my prediction? If the government try to force it through, I tell you what the lenders are going to do, Stu. They're going to do exactly what they did with the Building Safety Act.
Yeah.
They're going to shift as much of the liability as they can onto the
Absolutely.
conveyancers.
Absolutely.
I
100.
I think that a big lender at a conference caused furore until 3 years ago by effectively saying, well, of course, the conveyancing profession underwrites the lenders. And I think that was true. And I think that that's what the lenders will do again.
I'd be interesting. I feel like I've got a meeting with our indemnity insurers very shortly. So I'll be very interested to hear from them their thoughts on common hold.
Yeah.
Because they're always nervous of any kind of change. So sort of divulging the fact that you could be acting on plenty of common hold properties,
Yeah.
that would
And
be
again, I just
their
think that
appetite to insure.
the government's very fragmented attitude to all of this. I'm sure if anybody wants to invite us to the housing communities and local government committees, Stu, we'd both be delighted to contribute, wouldn't we? Well, it's a
Absolutely.
serious point because I do just think, government needs to be liaising with the people at the coalface and doing some joined up
It's
thinking.
the
And
same old thing all the time, though, isn't it?
it is,
Trying to project, you're solving some problems that actually don't exist.
yeah,
Focus on the problems that there are and can we, solve those? And like you said earlier, regulation of management companies would be a huge step forward that
massive.
nobody, apart from management companies, of course, would probably
Mm,
disagree with.
no, nobody would think that was a bad
A
idea
very practical solution to a problem,
to a very significant problem
significant problem. Yeah.
within the leasehold market.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a place to sort of stop then, Stu. I imagine it's going to be a topic that we come back to.
I think
I mean,
so.
just by way of sort of flagrant plug, of course, our Conveyancing Matters subscribers get their CPD videos every month, and we've already done an introductory video on common hold so that people can sort of start to get their heads around it. If it's in the government's crosshairs too, then conveyancers are going to start to need thinking about it. Need to think about it. So if anybody wants to subscribe, they can go to www.conveyancing-matters.co.uk, and we'd be delighted to see them. But
I
Stu,
think,
sort of,
dare I say, when you think about all the things over all the years that have hit the conveyancing industry, I think an introduction and push for common hold being the default tenure, and I think, were they actually the words that we used with
yeah,
default?
yeah.
So default tenure would be enormous.
Yes,
It would blow out the water, anything like the Building Safety Act.
yes, I agree.
It would be enormous. And can you imagine, when you think about the practical implication of this coming in, all of a sudden sitting there and people are drafting, documents under the banner of common hold, it it beggars belief. If you think about the practical
Mm,
ways in which it would work, number one, you've got to draft them. Then number two, you're receiving them to actually advise your client on them.
mm.
I just,
Well, I think it's interesting, Stu, isn't it? Because
I mean, what would you charge for fees? What would
how
you charge?
well how does the government make it the default tenure? I mean, would it have to legislate? Would it have to
Yes.
fall? Because effectively, what it would be saying, assuming, of course, they don't make it retrospective, so assuming it was all every new build sort of flat unit from date X, then had to be common hold. Well, that's effectively dictating to the developers and the market and the lenders,
Yeah.
isn't it? And I
Yeah.
still wonder whether the government would actually be prepared to take such an enormous step.
This is the sort of second important point, isn't it, when we talk about detail, and that is making it the default tenure. That means, yeah, as you say, all developers are going to have to onboard
Mm.
with, that wish and that process. And I can only imagine there'd be huge opposition to that.
There would be huge kickback, I would think.
Yeah,
So, I think the prediction is that it won't become the default form of
no,
tenure.
no.
Um, but I
Whether we'll
think
see an increase potentially. Do you know the numbers?
I think it's the Leasehold Advisory Service have got I think there's about sort of last time I looked something like only about 17 to 20
Yeah,
common hold developments in the entire country.
yeah, that's what I thought, 20 odd.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's incredible, isn't it? For
Yeah.
20 years,
Yeah, so one a year. One a
one a
year,
year.
Stu. One a year. So if it carries on at that rate, Stu, at least I'll either be retired or dead by the time we have to worry about common hold. So happy days.
Oh, Happy New
And
Year to you as well,
yeah,
then, blimey.
exactly. So on that positive note, Stu,
Yeah,
I'm sure this is a topic we'll come back to. As I say, if our lovely YouTube subscribers want to go back and look at our earlier chat a year or so ago on will ending leasehold really happen, I suspect that we come to a similar conclusion. But I'll see you soon, Stu. Take care now.
take care. See ya.
Bye.